I'd like to say how pleased I am to be here tonight. Malcolm Harbour said to me, trying to sort of get credit in the bank, you know, that I'm here tonight, Ed, Thursday night, I should be in my constituency, but I'm here for you. Well, you know, Malcolm, I'm here for you too. I was going to come tomorrow morning, but I've come tonight to be with you and to speak at this august gathering, unlike my Polish colleague, I note, who I assume I'll see tomorrow, and I'll make very plain my views on his absence here. And it's very, but it is very nice to be here. I have known Malcolm Harbour for a very long time, and he's an incredibly effective member of the European Parliament. And I think the Conservative Party, it's safe to say, has had its ups and downs in its relationships with Europe. And I think what has been great is that Malcolm has stood as a consistent engager with the Commission and as a very high-profile MEP, flying the flag, I think, for Britain as well, and as a leader in IT policy. And he's gained a huge amount of respect and knowledge, and for new, naive ministers like myself, he's a great source of counsel and advice. And as you know, well, you probably don't, he tells me who's in and who's out. So I know exactly who counts in this audience tonight. No, he doesn't really. So thank you, Malcolm, for inviting me, and thank you for all your advice on all these very complicated issues. So the real title of my talk tonight is The Internet Who Pays. And I'll start with the immediate politician's cop-out, which is that I'm not going to express a view one way or the other. I think what I'll try and do is frame the debate and give you a bit of insight into how the UK government is approaching these issues. As it won't surprise you to know, we're not particularly huge fans of regulation, and we would prefer to see, particularly with something as important as the internet, not only a light touch approach, but also the internet is evolving at such enormous speed. We actually have serious concerns about regulating too soon or too heavily. So, for example, I haven't yet seen any compelling evidence to suggest that the commercial arrangements on peering that exist at the moment, for example, are inadequate. And in terms of issues like net neutrality as well, I've made my views clear on that, and I'll expand on all that in a minute. So let's talk first about peering. Essentially, as you all know, a way information is exchanged across networks on the internet, and no one company obviously owns the transmission path between the supplier of content and the customer who gets that content at the end, and networks have to interconnect. The internet doesn't change what has always been the system, but it does make it more complex. And so the issue, the debate seems to be, is the current commercial model broken? Does there need to be some regulatory intervention? Well, my belief is that the model isn't broken. I think if it was broken, I think it would have become obvious a long time before this debate emerged. And I also think the second concern I have is that it's a slightly one-sided debate, dare I say it, launched by telecom companies, which ignores the current commercial arrangements that are already in place, but also the investment made by what you might call the content providers, obviously companies such as Google and Yahoo. And finally, I think if we were to go down the regulatory approach, it would serve as a huge distraction for the need for the European Union and the Commission to promote policies that will actually secure investment in fast broadband networks. And I also think, and I think this is also an important point to bear in mind whenever you're considering regulation, is whether or not it will stifle the actual innovation that we desperately need in European markets in order to raise our game. But I would say, of course, that it's important to have this debate, and I congratulate Commissioner Kroes for initiating it, because I think it's important to get the chief executives of telcos and others round a table to talk about how you get the huge investment that is going to be needed in order to create the super-fast broadband networks for the European Union. The estimates you've seen, people talk about £300 billion investment gap, are massive. And we know in the UK, and I'll talk about obviously broadband rollout in the UK in a minute, that there will need to be billions of pounds of investment. So it's absolutely vital to engage with telecom companies and others on this issue. But I note in the Financial Times at the end of April the substantial revenue required and the associated calls by some telcos for a new regulatory approach to peering, whereby what they said were the asynchronous traffic flows with respect to operators on the one hand and content providers on the others needed to be addressed. But in view of such dialogue and debate, there now seems to be somewhat of an expectation that something has to be done, and I think it was even alluded to in the EG8 forum yesterday. But as I say, I don't think there's a case for regulation, even in the past when competition was almost non-existent. And the case for regulated peering, whether at wholesale or retail level, has not been made. And indeed, when a similar revenue-raising approach known as network externalities was proposed at the ITU a couple of years ago, it was actually vigorously opposed by the telecoms operators as well as by many governments. And in that case, it involved telecom players paying fees to networks they use to route traffic in emerging economies. The argument then, as I'm sure it should be now, was that such issues are best left to the market and are not for governments. Peering began as a necessity in the early days of the internet when networks were small and localised, and so peering was essential to get traffic any great distance. But the internet and peering were then very much the preserve of the academic community. The concept has evolved to the mixed model of free and semi-commercial arrangements that we see today. But the ability for internet traffic of data packets to get to their destination via a number of readily available routes is one of the key strengths in both the success of the internet and its fundamental resilience. And anything that threatens that flexible peering, I think, undermines that infrastructure. And I think it's important as well to look at what happens in the market today. The internet today, I think it's a false conclusion to think that the internet today is an environment where all the gain is for content providers and all the pain is borne by network operators. It's clear that the network operators' revenue model depends on the very existence of rich and often bandwidth-hungry content, just as much as content providers are on networks for delivery of their product. So sometimes when you listen to the debate, you could be forgiven for thinking that networks are somehow doing content owners a favour for carrying their traffic. The reality is complex and fragmented. There's a whole array of different commercial models in play, with different payments being made or not being made to reflect disparate market conditions across the whole of the European Union. And although free peering, as it's known, is the norm in many parts of Europe, it's not the situation in all cases. In fact, Giuseppe Di Martino of the French video provider Dailymotion said that 40% of his revenues already go to support network operators and peering arrangements. And I think that reflects the reality. Content and service providers have always paid for delivery over networks, and this typically involves fees for the carriage of such content over networks or investment in the backbone of network themselves. BEREC have recently addressed the issue of peering in their response to the Commission's consultation on net neutrality. They addressed revenue streams from content providers to ISPs and examined the complex relationships that now exist on the internet, and they concluded that current commercial arrangements were adequate and there were no grounds to intervene. And while I'm talking about regulators, I wonder if part of the payment issue doesn't rest with them, and not just the ones in the European Union. For in listening to telecom operators, I understand that part of the payment problem, so to speak, is in telecom operators and other players in the telecom space not adhering to the commercial peering arrangements that they have actually negotiated. So given the significant changes in traffic flows, it seems logical that such agreements are renegotiated from time to time, and just as important that players adhere to them. And if there's a problem there that cannot be solved through commercial legal approaches, I wouldn't see a problem in regulators intervening in that respect. So in conclusion, I'd have to challenge the very notion that any new approach on payments is required. And if we did go down that road, would it be fair or would it work? Another issue, obviously, that is a very live issue in terms of the who pays for the internet debate is net neutrality. And some have commented the only reason that some telecom operators have called for a debate on peering is because they've not convinced policymakers or content providers that the latter should pay for the applications the telcos deliver. Whether that's true or not, I want to say that neither our government's approach, nor indeed the European Commission's approach, as outlined in the communication adopted by the Commissioner last month, rules out agreements whereby content providers would pay for managed delivery of their services. Now, I want to say at this point that net neutrality is an extraordinarily complex debate, and any government minister or official that doesn't want to trend on Twitter or be harassed by conspiracy theorists would do well to keep out of the net neutrality debate. And what I have tried to get across in the UK, and it was another sign of a naive minister who, coming into office, said this net neutrality debate seems quite interesting, I think I'll make a speech about it, is that we in Europe have a significantly competitive telecoms marketplace. And therefore, I don't think there is a need for regulation. And when I say that content providers could pay for managed delivery of services, what I'm not saying is that services should be degraded, their competitor services should be degraded, or that a customer that signs up for a specific service from an ISP at a specific speed should be in any way denied that service. That is absolutely vital. So I think that Commissioner Crowe's approach is absolutely the right one, which is to focus on the customer and to focus on competition and to ensure that customers are free to choose from a range of different network operators who should also be free to choose to offer a range of different services to the customer. Now, in the UK, we're very keen on superfast broadband. We published a document at the end of last year setting out our plans to roll out superfast broadband. And we've rather pretentiously perhaps said that we want to have the best superfast broadband network in Europe by 2015. So if you want to help my career, it would be delightful if other member states could slow down their investment in broadband at least until 2015. But it's been a fascinating year in terms of the debate. And I don't know whether other people from other member states find this, but the broadband agenda has moved rapidly up, whatever agenda I'm trying to refer to. It's become a much more lively political issue. In fact, speaking to Malcolm just before this dinner, we noted ruefully that, you know, for the first time, I think probably in history, we have backbench MPs in Parliament who express a genuine interest in telecoms regulation because they're desperate to have broadband in their constituencies, and quite rightly so. And I think we've taken a sensible approach. I obviously would say that, but I think we have. We've secured government support, £530 million plus. Do three people wandering past there if they want to come into the dinner. £530 million until the end of the Parliament, an additional £300 million for the 2 years after that. And we're driving it forward at the local level with local authorities and now local economic partnerships, which have replaced our regional development agencies. We've announced today 3 more pilots, so we now have 7 pilots rolling out. All of them are learning exercises, learning in how to procure, learning about what technology is best to hit the rural not spots. And we're very convinced that we'll spend that £530 million effectively. That will be matched. A lot of local authorities are coming up with their own match funding. It may be supported by European development funding. And although it sounds slightly perverse to say this, I think sometimes you can be more effective by not having quite enough money than by having too much money. I think the money will be spent effectively. I think the rapid changes in technology are driving down broadband. The other point not to lose sight of, and I think this goes back to what I was saying about peering, is that investment can be incentivised by deregulation. So we're as importantly focused on passive infrastructure access to BT's networks, to sharing of infrastructure, to reducing planning constraints where we can, to encouraging regulations that encourage developers building new houses, to include superfast broadband in their networks. So we think we've got clear and coherent strategy moving forward, and I'll be delighted to hear what others are doing as well. The final issue I just want to touch on very quickly was IPv6. Obviously, there's no point having super-fast broadband or indeed the internet unless it works properly. And we know that the IPv4 system has basically run out of room. So we're working to address this issue and to move to the new way of addressing known as IPv6. We don't know how long that's going to take, but we do believe it's needed, especially now with the Internet of Things beginning to emerge. And if we're going to continue to excel in our use of the Internet in Europe, that's a technology we need to grasp to maintain an effective network for commerce and innovation. In order to focus interest and promote the take-up of IPv6, I'll be hosting a meeting to discuss how we might best achieve this. We've set up a forum, 6 UK, led by business to drive this forward. But on IPv6 Day, the government will host in the UK a round table on Wednesday, the 8th of June, where we'll allow the interests involved in all this to express their concerns and their proposals. The UK government is absolutely delighted that the Commission has shown an interest in IPv6 and delighted by their lead in promoting the take-up of IPv6. In fact, they were well ahead of the game, in my view, and we believe, like the Commission, that the time is fast approaching where there is going to be a real need for IPv6 to promote innovation, to preserve cost-effective commercial services, and to link with global aspirations. So I thought I would just give a quick run around the houses, perhaps a detailed exposition of our views on peering, my views on net neutrality, which always get me into trouble, and no doubt will again tonight, and my views on IPv6 and broadband rollout. I'm thoroughly enjoying the job of being Telecoms Minister. I've got a very eclectic brief. I started this morning talking about archaeology, and now I'm talking, I hope, about the future technology of Europe. And I got the job by accident. My colleague John Penrose, who sits opposite me in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, told me that before the election there were only 2 jobs he could not do. He couldn't do the telecoms job because his wife runs a telecoms company, and he couldn't do anything to do with horse racing because his wife is an amateur jockey. And when he came into government, he was given the job as Minister for Telecommunications with responsibility for horse racing. So I was the Minister for Heritage, and 24 hours later I became the Minister for Communications. But I did know a bit about it in opposition because the shadow spokesman for telecommunications was my mentor, hero, Ken Clark. But Ken doesn't own a mobile phone, so he relied on me and Jeremy Hunt to look after that part of the portfolio, so I was somewhat prepared. I never thought I would say that I had an interest in, that I would go to dinners and say I'm terribly interested in spectrum policy, but I am. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I look forward to your questions.